Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Picture this. Somewhere in a distant memory, a news anchor delivers a story with a knowing smirk. An elderly woman, the anchor chuckles, bought a cup of coffee at McDonald's. She sat down, fiddled with the lid, spilled the hot liquid all over her own lap, suffered a little ouchie, and then decided to sue the fast food giant for $2.86 million. The punchline writes itself. She spilled coffee on herself and blamed McDonald's. What a country, what a joke, what a greedy old lady. That story, in some form, has been told millions of times. It appears in late-night monologues, in newspaper op-eds, in mockery of the legal system, in the minds of almost everyone who has ever heard the phrase frivolous lawsuit. For 30 years, the McDonald's coffee case has been Exhibit A, the proof, the smoking gun, for everyone who believes that Americans sue too much for too little. It is the cautionary tale about how a single stupid mistake can bankrupt an innocent company and pay off a scheming plaintiff. If you are like most people, you probably believe you know the whole story. The lady put the coffee between her knees while she was driving. She was texting or reaching for something or driving distractedly, and she was careless. The coffee was barely warm. She was fine, maybe a little red, and a jury, caught up in sympathy and greed, gave her bottomless piles of money. Her lawyer made a fortune. McDonald's had to pay. Justice was mocked. The end. But here is the record scratch. Here is the moment where the joke stops being funny. Almost every detail you just pictured is wrong. She was not driving. She was a passenger in a parked car. The coffee was not lukewarm. It was hot enough to cause third-degree burns in 3 seconds. She was not fine. Her skin peeled away down to the muscle and fat, and she spent 2 years in disability recovering from skin grafts. And the biggest lie of all, the story did not happen naturally. It was manufactured. It was a deliberate piece of propaganda, engineered by corporate and political interests to make you laugh at a woman whose flesh was nearly boiled off her body. Let us start with the real woman, because she has been invisible in this story, reduced to a caricature with a walker and a grudge. Stella Liebeck. She was 79 years old in 1992. She lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She had been a member of her local community her whole adult life, a retired waitress and a grandmother, not a serial litigant, not a scam artist. On a Tuesday in February 1992, her grandson, Chris, was driving her through the McDonald's drive-thru. Chris picked up 2 coffees. They paid, and they pulled into a parking space so the cup holders, or the lack of them, would not end the afternoon in a mess. Now, here's a detail the punchline always leaves out. They were parked, not moving. The car was stationary. Chris had pulled into a parking space precisely so they could add their cream and sugar safely. Stella decided she wanted to add some cream and some sweetener to her coffee. The car was parked, so it seemed harmless. She placed the paper cup between her knees to free up both hands. She gripped the lid and began to peel it back. The lid popped, suddenly, unevenly, and the coffee sloshed over the rim, right into her lap. Now, this is where the story as you know it says, "Oops, well, that's on her." But consider what she did not know. That coffee was being served at nearly 190 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly boiling. The McDonald's Corporate Operations Manual required franchisees to hold the coffee at a temperature between 180 and 190 degrees, roughly 20 degrees hotter than the coffee served by its biggest competitors, and far hotter than the 135 to 150 degree coffee brewed in most home machines. Here is the dirty secret of McDonald's temperature policy. They kept the coffee scalding for a simple economic reason. Hotter coffee keeps its flavor longer sitting in a warming urn. It extends the acceptable shelf life of the product. It means the restaurant can brew a batch, hold it nearly boiling for hours, and not lose customers to lukewarm coffee that tasted stale. The temperature had little to do with what was good for the customer and everything to do with corporate efficiency and profit. But there is an even more important reason McDonald's kept the coffee so hot. The company knew, for over a decade, that this temperature caused serious burns. That is what turns this from a careless old lady story into a case about corporate responsibility. When the coffee spilled into Stella Liebeck's lap, it did not just make her uncomfortable. The nearly boiling liquid soaked into her cotton sweatpants and held against her skin, cooking it. She suffered third-degree burns across 6% of her body, with lesser burns over a full 16%. The burns were on her pelvic region, her thighs, her inner thighs, and her genitals. The skin was burned down to the muscle and fatty tissue beneath. Doctors had to surgically debride the dead tissue, remove the burns, and graft healthy skin over the wounds. She was hospitalized for 8 days. She needed multiple skin grafts. She required painful whirlpool treatments to keep the grafted areas clean. For 2 years afterward, she was partially disabled. She could not walk normally. She lost nearly 20% of her body weight, about 20 pounds, as she struggled through recovery. Her daughter had to move in to provide care for 3 weeks during the worst of it. This was not a joke. This was a catastrophic, life-altering injury. Now, before we hand her $1 billion, notice something. Stella Liebeck did not want to sue anyone. She was not looking for a windfall. After her medical bills started piling up, her daughter suggested she might call McDonald's and ask them to cover the hospital costs. Stella agreed. She simply wanted her medical expenses paid, roughly $20,000. She called McDonald's. She asked them to pay her medical bills. She did not demand a fortune. She did not threaten them. She just wanted help covering the cost of the burns their coffee had caused. McDonald's offered her $800. $800 for 2 years of disability, for 3 weeks of a daughter becoming a caregiver, for skin grafts all over her lower body. $800. That is the moment Stella Liebeck became a plaintiff. Not out of greed, but because a multi-billion-dollar corporation, when confronted with a victim of its own product, offered her less than the price of a used microwave oven. The case went to trial in 1994 after McDonald's refused repeated attempts to resolve it, and at trial, the truth came out. Here's what the jury learned. McDonald's had a written corporate policy requiring coffee be served at 180 to 190 degrees. The company had been told over and over for more than a decade that this was dangerous. From 1982 to 1992, McDonald's had received more than 700 reports of people being burned by their coffee, to varying degrees of severity. Some of those burns were serious. The company had already paid out more than $500,000 to settle Scalding claims, and they had never fixed the problem. In fact, the company's own internal quality assurance manager had testified in previous cases that the temperature was a known hazard. A food scientist who testified for McDonald's admitted that at 190 degrees, coffee will produce third-degree burns through clothing in about 3 seconds. At 180 degrees, in about 12 to 15 seconds. Competitors serve their coffee at 160 degrees, where a spill takes 20 seconds or more to burn, still painful, but giving a person time to react and wipe it off. The difference between 20 seconds and 3 seconds is the difference between a bad afternoon and a permanent disability. McDonald's chose to ignore all of this. They kept the coffee scalding, even though they knew, because the hot coffee kept the product fresh on the shelf and saved them money. And when someone got hurt, they offered $800 and hoped they would go away. The jury deliberated, and they were furious. They awarded Stella Liebeck $200,000 in compensatory damages to cover her medical bills, her pain, and her suffering. But they also attributed 20% of the fault to Stella herself, reasoning that she had spilled it on herself, so her award was reduced to $160,000. Then the jury wanted to punish McDonald's. They wanted to send a message. They awarded her $2.7 million in punitive damages. That number was not pulled from the air. It was calculated to equal roughly 2 days of McDonald's coffee sales worldwide. That is the signal the jury was trying to send. The company had made a fortune selling a product they knew was dangerous, and the jury wanted to return about 2 days' worth of that profit to the victim. Now, here is the part you never hear in the joke. The $2.7 million was almost immediately reduced by the judge. The judge capped the punitive damages at 3 times the compensatory amount, bringing them down to $480,000. The final total was about $640,000. And then both sides appealed. McDonald's appealed the judgment, and Stella appealed the reduction. Before the appeals were decided, the parties settled out of court for a confidential sum that was reportedly well under the $640,000, perhaps as low as $500,000. The lawyer's fee likely consumed a third of it. And of that amount, a significant portion went straight to the hospitals and surgeons who had treated her burns. The fortune people imagined she pocketed never existed. So the punchline you have heard, that she was handed millions, never happened. The actual result was a settlement of roughly $500,000, most of which went to legal fees and medical bills, for a woman who had permanently disfigured her lower body and spent 2 years in pain because a corporation chose profit over safety. So that is the truth, but the truth was not what spread around the world. And this brings us to the second half-truth woven into this story, the origin of the lie. Because here is the thing, the story of the greedy old lady did not spread by accident. It was engineered. After the verdict, the corporate insurance industry and business interests recognized a gift. Here was a courtroom case involving a fast food chain, a spilled cup of coffee, and a large damage award. They could reframe it as a story about a ridiculous lawsuit, a story that would serve their long campaign to limit what injured consumers can recover from corporations, what they call tort reform. So they set to work. They did not just let the facts speak. They built a narrative, and their narrative was brilliantly simple. Forget the third-degree burns. Forget the 700 complaints. Forget the medical bills and the skin grafts. The story they needed was, greedy old lady spilled coffee on herself, sued for millions, got them. To sell that story, they had to strip away every inconvenient detail. And the media, eager for a snappy joke, obliged. Here is a shocking statistic. The Albuquerque Journal initially reported the case in a detailed article of nearly 700 words, with all the grim specifics about the burns and the temperature and the complaints. But as the story got picked up by bigger and bigger outlets, it got shorter and shorter and more distorted. By the time it hit major national media, some versions of the story had been condensed to fewer than 50 words, and in those 50 words, all the truth had been squeezed out. The passenger sitting in a parked car became a woman driving with a cup between her knees. Sometimes she was texting. Sometimes she was distracted. The third-degree burns disappeared. The 700 prior complaints disappeared. The fact that McDonald's had a written policy requiring near-boiling coffee disappeared. What remained was the punchline, silly lady, hot coffee, greedy lawsuit, millions she didn't deserve. At the same time, the case became political. In the mid-90s, a coalition of Republicans promoted a legislative agenda called the Contract with America, which included a plan for tort reform called the Common Sense Legal Reform Act. They needed a poster child for the supposedly broken legal system, and they seized on the McDonald's coffee case as Exhibit A. Pollsters and consultants turned it into what one University of Washington researcher described as the most famous case in American law, a story so distorted that even judges and scholars warned it could not be cited as an example of anything. And yet, it spread. The irony is profound. The very incompetence that the joke mocks, the image of a helpless woman who cannot even handle a cup of coffee, was deployed by political operatives to justify stripping legal protections from real victims. They took a woman who had been genuinely, horrifically injured, and they turned her into the face of everything they wanted to change about the law. So why does this correction matter? Why should we care that a 3-decade-old lawsuit was misreported? It matters because the story has real, lasting consequences. The false narrative of the greedy coffee lady has been used over and over to persuade the public that lawsuits are frivolous, that injury victims are scammers, and that companies should not be held accountable for dangerous products. It has shaped tort reform debates, jury perceptions, and how Americans think about responsibility. Every time a real victim of corporate negligence tries to seek justice, they risk being judged against the fictional Stella from the joke. And it matters for a more personal reason. We did this to a real person. Stella Liebeck became a laughingstock while she was still healing. Her name became a punchline while she was still in pain. She did not deserve that. She asked for $20,000 to cover her medical bills, and instead, she got death threats from people who believed the propaganda and a permanent place in the mocking halls of pop culture. She died in 2004, quietly, remembered by strangers mainly as the woman who spilled coffee on herself and complained too much. There is a larger lesson here about how facts die. A story is powerful. A story is easy to remember. A story fits on a bumper sticker or in a joke. But the story of the greedy old lady was not just a simplification. It was a deliberate inversion of the truth. The truth was that a corporation served a product hot enough to liquefy skin, ignored 700 warnings that it was doing so, and then pushed back so hard on the one victim who fought for her medical costs that she became a national punchline. In the end, the real villains of this story were not the Burns and not the greedy lawyers the politicians warned us about. The villains were the people who saw a serious workplace of corporate negligence and chose to turn it into a weapon aimed at every future victim who might try to hold a powerful company responsible. Now, here is the honest complication. Was Stella Liebeck completely blameless? Of course not. The jury found her 20% at fault, and that is a fair assessment. She did hold a hot coffee between her knees. She did spill it on herself. Any reasonable person, knowing the risks, might have been more careful. She was not a perfect victim. She made a mistake. But here is the difference between a mistake and negligence. A mistake is spilling a cup of coffee in a parked car. Negligence is knowing for a decade that your coffee causes third-degree burns, watching 700 people get injured, paying out $500,000 in damages, and changing nothing. The jury looked at that distinction, and they gave Stella the benefit of the doubt on the burns, and they hit McDonald's with the punitive verdict because one person's error was dwarfed by a corporation's deliberate, profitable, decade-long gamble. The next time you hear the coffee joke, remember the numbers that got squeezed out of those 50 words. Remember 190 degrees. Remember 3 seconds to a third-degree burn. Remember 700 complaints. Remember the $800. Remember the 2 years of skin grafts and the permanent scars. The price of a corporate policy that valued shelf life over safety. Remember that she was a passenger, she was parked, and she was real. We love a good punchline, and the story of the greedy coffee lady is a great one. It rhymes, it fits on a t-shirt, it gets a laugh. But the best punchlines, the ones that last, are usually the truest, and this one was never true. It was a fabrication, polished for 30 years by people who had a reason to want you to laugh. Stella Liebeck did not get rich off McDonald's. She got burned, and we let ourselves be told she was the villain. Maybe the real half-truth here is not about coffee at all. It is about who gets to define the moral of the story. It is about how easily a corporation and a political movement can take a tragedy, strip it of its flesh and blood, and hand it back to the public wearing a clown costume. The clown is a lie. The flesh and blood were real. And unlike the punchline, the burns lasted for years. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.